Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the cutting-edge issues shaping national security and defense. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the Institute. This is the final installment of Season 3 of the Expert Series and the final episode of 2024. Today we'll be discussing the biggest challenges Canada grappled with over the past 12 months, and we'll look ahead to see what issues we'll need to continue prioritizing in the year ahead. It's been a notable year for Canada. We saw the long-awaited defense policy update, Our North Strong and Free, the recently released Arctic Foreign Policy document, the ongoing saga of foreign interference and diplomatic tensions with India and China, and most recently, the re-election of President-elect Donald J. Trump and the potentially transformative implications both for our bilateral relationship and for global security. So we'll hear from our fellows Cleo Paskal, Chuck Davies, and Kolga about what they thought were the most significant developments for Canadian defense and security this year, and also for international security. We asked them basically two questions. What were the biggest challenges in 2024, and what lies ahead? Before we do that, we'll go to a recording of a call I had earlier this week with my great colleague and friend, CDA Deputy Director Joe Varner. We discussed the most significant geopolitical challenges we'll be grappling with in the next few months, as well as his analysis of where Canada stands on the global stage after a tumultuous year. This is the Expert Series.
I think this past year, Canada's looked very vulnerable, and we've had a lot of developments from Our North Strong and Free, new CDS. It's no longer just 2% at NATO anymore. It's 2% and beyond. Arctic foreign policy, foreign interference. We can keep going. What do you think was the most major defense and security concern or challenge?
From my perspective, the most major challenge is trying to convince our allies that we're serious about national defense and national security. And I think that uphill battle, even with the release of the defense policy and the promise that we'll get to 2% of defense spending by 2032, 7 years from now, and all the other things that the government has said and not done have left us with a huge credibility gap with our allies, particularly the United States. And you're seeing it play out with Donald Trump. And I think, Donald Trump is basically calling Canada on its behavior. And it's put us in quite a spot. And people in this country think that if we come up with, little things to appease Donald Trump or to make him happy, that he's going to go away. And he's there for the next 4 years. And perhaps, they find it in them to have another term. But the fact of the matter is the dynamic with Donald Trump and his administration is a power dynamic, and Trump doesn't care about details. He cares about being seen to win politically and to dominate internationally. And right now, Canada's in his clutches and in his target sites, and we have a real problem. And so the one-offs and we'll get there eventually, and all the excuses have now come home to roost, and we're now, on the spot. The world is arguably more dangerous now than it was at the height of the last Cold War. And the international security environment is deteriorating, in my mind, at a rate not seen since about 1938. The U.S. is getting ready for President-elect Donald Trump, who seems inclined for NATO and the EU to deal with Russia. And the new administration appears to be looking to both deter Iran and North Korea and contain China to the first island chain. NATO and the EU are struggling with increasing their defense expenditures, increasing defense industrial capacity, rebuilding their military power, and knowing that they are likely less than 7 years away from another major European war with Moscow. The Five Eyes are struggling with the unreliability of Canada and New Zealand, while facing relentless attacks by Russia and China, and to a lesser extent Iran and North Korea. And AUKUS is struggling with the expansion and the ability to share technology and build nuclear submarines for Australia. And the U.S. non-NATO bilateral partners like Taiwan, Japan, South Korea struggle with the thought of renewed defense relationships with Washington, while at the same time pondering the viability and the wisdom of nuclear armament. Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran have all threatened war, and each is in the process of preparing for a major war with the West and their allies. Russia's invaded Ukraine, launched a massive war on NATO's doorstep. China is salami slicing in the Himalayas. taking one bit of foreign territory at a time and attempting to push all of its neighbors out of the South China Sea. North Korea is a state preparing for a regional war with missile tests directed at its neighbors, and Iran is bent on regional domination and the eradication of the Jewish state. Putin's dream, Russian President Vladimir Putin's dream, outlined in a 2011 speech, is to regain the borders of the Soviet Union and regain its former greatness. And Russia is 2 years into its war with Ukraine, is rearming and rebuilding its military at an astounding rate. It has placed its economy on a wartime footing. Russia has a large army, air force, and navy backed up by the world's second most powerful nuclear arsenal. And Russia has used hypersonic cruise missiles and ballistic missiles um, in its day-to-day strikes on Ukraine. Russia also used low-level chemical weapons in the fighting along the front lines. And without Western aid, Ukraine may be on the verge of losing more territory to Russia. Poland, the Baltic countries, Finland, and Sweden have all been the target of Russian threats. Russia's nuclear doctrine seems to be geared to de-escalate a war by using nuclear weapons, and it seems to have lowered the threshold of using nuclear weapons. Russia's fortifying the Arctic and engaging in a hybrid warfare campaign against NATO, and that includes arson, sabotage, assassination, cyber attacks, GPS attacks, and attacks on undersea cables. In the Pacific, China has now surpassed the United States in terms of number of warships, 355 vessels. China is catching up with the United States in terms of air power. It's doubling its nuclear arsenal to 500 deployed warheads, has the largest arsenal in the region of dual-use missile systems, is engaged in hidden space operations, and seems to covet the moon. It's made claims on the territory of India, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, and even Russia. And it's threatened war with India, Japan, and Taiwan, and prepared to seize Taiwan by force in the next 3 years. It's tested a fractional orbital bombardment system that would bypass our NORAD early warning system to attack North America by surprise, and develop hypersonic glide vehicles, and as a warfighting strategy to win a nuclear war. China has designs on our Arctic. North Korea has continued with its military programs, both conventional and nuclear, at an alarming pace. The Hermit Kingdom has severed all ties with South Korea and, by some accounts, is prepared for total war. Another North Korean nuclear test could occur at any time in the lead up to and around the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. North Korea in the last year or so has tested its first solid fuel road mobile canisterized nuclear capable intercontinental range ballistic missile that can reach anywhere in North America. And similarly, it has tested an intermediate range ballistic missile and cruise missiles and hypersonic missiles, uh, both in the air and allegedly at sea. North Korea, Russia, and China does not differentiate between Canada and the United States as a nuclear target set. And North Korea, like Chinese nuclear strategy, hinges on attacking and destroying its enemies in the region while threatening North American cities to deter a United States nuclear strike. We sit on the verge of a regional war between Iran and its proxy militias, Israel, and the U.S. and their allies. Tehran has changed its military doctrine to include direct confrontation with Israel and is trying to revive its tattered ring of fire strategy it clings to in hopes of destroying the Jewish state. Tehran launched 2 massive drone and missile attacks on the Jewish state, and Iran is only a matter of 3 to 4 months away from having enough weapons-grade nuclear material to make upwards of 12 nuclear weapons. It has a large missile inventory of cruise and ballistic missiles that are dual use, and Tehran is enriching more uranium, and they're still arming and training proxy militias, several of which have recently been badly mauled by Israel, like Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hamas. But the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq continue to threaten and even attack United States-led coalition forces, and Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen continue to harass international shipping in the Red and Arabian Seas. Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are all strategic partners of one another. All are prepared individually and as a group to challenge the Western liberal rules-based order. Russia is being armed with Iranian drones, North Korean missiles and ammunition, and Chinese weapon systems, spare parts, and satellite intelligence. And from nuclear weapons technology to long-range missiles to nuclear submarines, Russia is assisting the other three states in their warfighting pursuits. This view of war is along the lines of the Russian concept of political war or active measures. They continually try to manipulate Western democracies, and the dictators are playing geopolitical chess while we are all playing checkers.
Well, that was my good colleague, Joe Varner, and I think he provided some pretty prescient and in-depth analysis there, not only of the challenges Canada faces, but of the challenges currently present in the international security environment. And I look forward to continuing doing these shows with Joe in the new year. Next, we'll listen to Marcus Kolga first about some of his reflections over the past year. Next, we'll go to Cleo Paskal, who will discuss Canada-India relations this past year, foreign interference, and she'll also touch upon some of the recent developments in the Indo-Pacific. And then we'll close out with longtime CDA fellow Chuck Davies, who actually recently finished a book, and when it's out, I encourage you all to go pick it up. Chuck and I are going to discuss defense challenges that happened in Canada over the past year, the challenges posed by President-elect Donald Trump, and what we can expect in Canada's relations in the coming year. He also discussed some ongoing procurement challenges more broadly. So we'll close the episode out with Chuck, but before that, we'll go to Marcus and then Cleo.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'd like nothing more than to end the year on a little bit of optimism. Unfortunately, there's very little to be optimistic about. But what am I concerned about, and what will I be watching for in 2025? Well, like anyone else, I'll be watching for what Donald Trump decides to do with Ukraine, what the U.S. relationship will be like with NATO during his administration, and of course the relationship with Canada. What's recently been dismissed as a joke by Donald Trump when he refers to Canada as the 51st state, I think has the potential of becoming a rather serious problem. Mr. Trump's devout followers seem to be taking this suggestion rather seriously, as do many of his Canadian followers. And at the moment, there doesn't appear to be a single Canadian federal leader who is standing up and challenging it. And this kind of thing, as we've seen with many other issues before, needs to be nipped in the bud before it metastasizes into an actual movement. We've also seen Russian state media jump on this issue, and we know that the opportunists on the extremes of our political spectrum are also exploiting this and will continue to do so over the coming months and years unless we stop it. The coming year will also be an important one for Vladimir Putin and his war against Ukraine and his efforts to break down unity within NATO. It's quite clear that some form of negotiation will begin to stop Russia's war against Ukraine. In his recent marathon year-end press conference, Vladimir Putin said that Russia was close to achieving its goals in Ukraine, and that he was open to some form of negotiations facilitated by the Trump administration. What exactly those goals are remains unknown. We know that at the start of Vladimir Putin's, quote, 3-day operation against Ukraine, that denazification and demilitarization were the primary objectives. Obviously, the reoccupation and colonization of eastern Ukraine, if not most of the country, were the true objectives. And recall that Putin has stated that the reconstitution of the Soviet Union is also one of his objectives. Now, it's entirely possible that Donald Trump will try to force Ukraine to concede the territory currently occupied by Russia and will probably reject Ukraine's membership in NATO. And if I were an optimist, which I certainly am not, we might hope that Donald Trump would recognize that backing Ukraine and strengthening its position is also actually in the interests of the United States. It's also in Donald Trump's personal interest as the leader of his country to demonstrate strength to Putin, who only understands and respects power. And like the schoolyard bully who steals everyone's lunch money until he's challenged, Putin will continue to bully the Western world until someone stands up to them. So Western leaders need to appeal to Trump's vanity and probably just speak in a language that he understands. That means convincing Trump that he can save his people and everyone else from this schoolyard bully by pushing back and giving Putin a bloody nose. I'm also deeply concerned by Russia's growing sabotage operations across the Western world. Over the past year and a half, we've seen operations targeting various railroad systems in Europe. Russia's also been jamming aircraft GPS systems in Northern Europe and the Baltic Sea region. We've seen jamming of shipping navigation systems causing dangerous situations and increasing, of course, the possibility of various different spills, oil, chemicals. There have also been cases of arson in various European states attributed to Russian intelligence. The FSB was behind anti-Semitic vandalism and graffiti in France last year. And we're also now aware that incendiary devices were placed on aircraft in Europe, and some of those aircraft were actually headed to Canada. And so these operations will continue, and Canada is very much a target of them. We also know that a senior GRU colonel, intelligence colonel, was operating inside Canada for decades after he was arrested last year in Norway. So important was this intelligence officer that he was actually included in a swap, a prisoner swap organized by Western allies for political prisoners held captive inside Russia. And so this is also, it's a significant threat to our safety in Canada and the security of our democracy, and it's one that we're just not taking seriously enough. Information and influence operations are, of course, also a key part of Russian intelligence operations. And I hope that in 2025, the Canadian government will start investigating those morally unscrupulous Canadians who continue to this day to collaborate with foreign authoritarian regimes like Russia, those who appear on sanctioned Russian state media channels like RT, and those who work with regime-controlled think tanks like Vladimir Putin's Valdai Club and the Russian International Affairs Council to legitimize and normalize Kremlin narratives that undermine Western confidence in our defense alliances and that seek to undermine our democracy and polarize our societies. And of course, we're going to have an election in 2025, and we know that these governments are actively seeking to influence them, despite the fact that we've held an inquiry into those sorts of operations and activities. Vulnerabilities in nomination processes persist, and foreign regimes are actively taking advantage of those right now as we speak. So in terms of democratic processes, Canada is still very much the Wild West. Finally, I'll be keeping an eye on the implementation of Bill C-70, which many activists hope will serve to defend them against transnational repression and attacks by foreign authoritarian regimes. Currently, there is still little awareness, little coordination, and certainly not enough enforcement of our laws against those who seek to intimidate, harass, and silence Canadian activists, journalists, and vulnerable communities. The Russian, Chinese, and Iranian governments and their enablers, proxies, and influencers inside our country are still able to act with almost complete impunity in their efforts to violate our democratic and cognitive sovereignty. And I believe that this represents actually one of the greatest threats to our democratic freedoms and our democratic sovereignty. But I am hopeful that the government will start to take action to disrupt and deter and prevent these sorts of operations in the coming years. So this is what I'm keeping an eye on and what I'm concerned about in the coming year.
I'm going to talk about the area that I cover the most, which is the Indo-Pacific. And in that context, the relationship with India was definitely the overarching story. There was an incredible amount of coverage about Canada in the Indian media, and including some actually quite excellent investigative reporting about some of the issues that we have domestically with terrorist financing and all that sort of stuff. Of course, it fit into the larger concerns that the Indian government had about the way the incidents were handled, because for them it looked political, regardless of the merits of the case. It was very much seen as a political move in part to create division between the Five Eyes and India. Now, in the world that we work in now, which is a political warfare type world, perception is as important as reality in many cases. And this was incredibly damaging for Canada's reputation, not just in India, but across the Indo-Pacific. So again, this has nothing to do with the merits of the case. This has to do how this was handled. There was the disastrous G20 meeting and then the statement on the floor of Parliament, which made it look more political. And I think it has seriously affected Canada's profile and ability to work with security partners, potential security partners in a lot of the non-Western world.
Do you see this changing at all with a potential change of government in 2025, or do you think it's an issue that might persist regardless of who the head of state is?
It's people are going to be judged on their actions, and it would help if there were if prosecutions that actually started to show proof of some of the claims came to the courts. It would also help. The Touchstone incident, apart from the ones that happened in Canada, were the changes in Bangladesh, and things like canceling the Diwali celebrations and stuff like that just really resonated poorly. The Conservatives haven't picked up the baton in the way that many, I think, in India were hoping. So we'll see if there is a change of government and when the new government comes in, how they're actually behaving, and it's particularly marked in comparison to how President Trump, even though he's not back in office yet, has handled some of these things. He tweeted about, Happy Diwali, and he also tweeted about the persecution of religious minorities, including Christians and Hindus in Bangladesh, at a time when Canada has not been, none of the parties have really been front and center on any of this. So we can see that the U.S. change of administration is definitely going to change perceptions of the U.S. In the region, but we haven't seen any strong leadership from any of the Canadian leaders on this topic as of yet.
Well, thanks, Cleo. That was a good kind of look back at the past year, and I would agree that India-Canada relations have been a huge topic of discussion and of concern. Looking ahead to 2025, what might you say are some either emerging or some emerging security trends or challenges happening maybe in the world that Canada might want to prioritize or hedge against?
So looking beyond what's happening in the U.S., obviously a lot's going to depend on whether Canada goes to elections, but there is, again, the area that I look at the most, the Indo-Pacific. There's a lot of concern about what Chinese PRC activities will be. And on the political warfare front, it's already incredibly aggressive, especially you can see it with the Philippines, for example. But what we'll see is whether or not if there is a winding down of the war in Ukraine, how that frees up resources for other sorts of activities, whether the PRC uses it as cover for some sort of blockade or something in Taiwan. It has a lot of options, and the PRC has a history of using distractions in other areas to strike. So it used the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, to hit India in 1962. So while there are all these moving pieces, I would say you can't underestimate intent coming out of Beijing to advance its position through, at the minimum, political warfare and possibly kinetic. And Canada is just not prepared for that at all. With the penetration domestically in terms of cyber and criminal activity and all that sort of stuff and the ports is already off the charts. But in terms of being able to deploy abroad, we are sorely tested to be able to be useful, even in things that we are traditionally quite good at, like, for example, cyber.
My biggest concern nationally is that our government continues to follow basically a transactional approach to defense, security, and even foreign affairs issues. I don't see any signs of any coherent strategies. Yes, we have a Trans-Pacific strategy or Pacific region strategy. Not a lot of depth and not a lot of. It's, talk is cheap. It's not a lot of signs that we're having a serious taking a serious strategic approach to engaging internationally. Even on security, domestic security, where we go into reaction mode. Donald Trump says something, and because he's going to become president, we're doing stuff, but we're not doing stuff for our security. We're doing stuff to make him happy enough so that we don't get clobbered economically. So that's the first concern I have in terms of us as a nation. The second one is watching the Russia-Ukraine war. The Russians are gradually learning how to fight again, and that's not good for us. I remember seeing one or two critics, of defense, saying, you don't have to worry about the Russians. You don't need to spend money on defense because the Russians are so incompetent that they're not a threat. Well, I'm sorry, they still have 1.5 million troops, or roughly 1.5 million troops. They are figuring out the art of armed conflict again. Mostly at the tactical level. I'm not seeing a lot of sense of an operational competence, but practice makes perfect eventually, and it's going to be an expensive learning experience for the Russians, and particularly in their casualty rates. But the long-term trends are not good for Ukraine, and that's quite a worry for me. And the third thing that I've observed over the last year is the reinforcement of an idea that I think became evident in the previous year. But industrial capacity is at least as important, perhaps more important, in terms of a long, protracted war than how great a military force you put into the field right away. So I think that this country, there has been some acknowledgement, apparently, in government policy, in the defense policy update, of a need for some focus on industrial capacity. But again, I think I'm not seeing signs of a strategy that takes us anywhere in particular. In fact, all the signs are from throughout the last year, from 2024, is, again, it's talk is cheap, and so we're going to do stuff. We're going to buy ammunition. We're going to make ammunition, and then they wait, 4 to 6 months before starting to talk to industry about a contract for the ammunition that they say they want to provide. So, all in all, it has not been a very good year, and frankly, no party in Parliament has shown any signs of that they would be any different. So that's 2024. I'm afraid of a bit of a pessimist, but you got to call it the way you see it.
You mentioned the DPU, and it's interesting because we had you on for a similar program about a year ago now, and I think your takeaway in 2023 was you were surprised maybe at the extent to which the government was unable to forward a defense policy update in that time frame. There had been lots of talk about it. So, I mean, the defense policy update did come out this year and around spring. I'm wondering if you might be able to, you've talked about it a little bit, but I'm wondering if you might be able to offer your reflections on the DPU, especially now that it's, maybe 6 or so months behind us.
Yeah, I think it was a tough go. I know Minister Anand, when she was trying to fight the good fight through the Prime Minister's office and so on, came out second best. Minister Blair, I guess, didn't have a lot of choice. So the TPU is it's remarkable in that this is the first time in modern Canadian history, or perhaps any Canadian history, that a single prime minister has produced more than a single defense policy statement. So that's good news, and there is some good stuff in it. But it's another case of talk is cheap, and I'm not seeing. I've not seen signs of determined implementation of either strong, secure, engaged or R&R strong and free as defense policies. I think they are taking a very transactional approach to taking care of business.
Now going into 2025, the new year, and thinking about the months ahead and the year ahead, what do you think are some of the key or central challenges that a Canadian government might face, or that we might face from a nation, again, from a security or defense standpoint?
Well, a big challenge we face is a gentleman named Donald Trump, and he is connecting economic issues of great importance to this country to security, defense, and other areas of national business that frankly no party in Parliament, as I mentioned before, has shown much interest in. So I think in the absence of pressure from the U.S., political paralysis on defense issues would continue no matter which party forms government next year. The wild card is the tariff threat, and just how serious that is, and B, how successful lesser actions on the part of government might be enough to buy him off, or to stave off the worst economic impacts of the tariffs. So I think it's an open question just how much either the current or the next Canadian government is going to feel the need to focus on defense issues. As I said, no party really shows any sign of having a plan, a strategy that they were going to follow in terms of the future of the Canadian Armed Forces. And in that context, sort of the existing programs, the work that's being done within the defense bureaucracy and the government bureaucracy on recruiting, training, and the existing equipment programs, they'll chug along on autopilot. But I don't suspect there will be a lot of active government political leadership on those files. I do worry a lot about the Ukraine and Russia situations. And Russia is starting to feel, I get the sense from readings that I've done, I'm getting the sense that Russia is starting to feel some pressure in terms of economics, domestic economics and domestic demographics and domestic opinion about the war. And it's not clear to me what Vladimir Putin has in the way of options for responding to those pressures in a way that maintains his secure position within Russia. And so that could possibly become a little bit unpredictable through the year. The fact is that the only way that there will ever be a realistic negotiated settlement between those two countries is if Ukraine is able, with Western support, to persuade Vladimir Putin that he's not going to win militarily, and that he will have to cut a deal. Because right now, he seems to be hoping that the battlefield pressure that is being put on Ukraine, very tactical and very limited in scope, realistically speaking, it sounds a lot, but it's not a lot of room that they're taking over. That may lead him. The fact that they're making some battlefield progress may lead him to continue to drag this thing out, because he thinks in the long term he can outweigh us, and he can defeat the much smaller Ukrainian forces. At the same time, he seems to have a blind spot where it comes to his partner in China, and I find it really interesting with China's focus on Arctic resources and being an Arctic nation, notwithstanding that the nearest approach to Chinese land is something like 1,500 kilometers from the Arctic Circle and about 2,000 kilometers from the Arctic Ocean. If I were, advising Vladimir Putin, I'd be saying I think I'd want to watch my eastern flank here. Now, the geography, the terrain, and everything else, the demographics out there, there's no immediate threat of China moving in on Vladivostok or any of the Russian Far East. But I think there's a really interesting dynamic, which, if I were in Russia, would make me a little bit nervous out there. I don't know how that's going to play out, and certainly over the next year, probably not at all. But it's a long-term question that leaves me scratching my head in terms of the relationship between those two countries. And in terms of China, of course, there's still its intense intentions with respect to Taiwan and its other neighbors in the region. It's still playing the bully boy. It's still developing its military capabilities and capacities. So that's an area of considerable interest to me in terms of where things go there. And then finally, the thing that I'm not sure yet any of us in the Western democracies have figured out how we're going to adapt to a Trump-led U.S. But that's something that we're all going to have to come to grips with. And I kind of think it would be smarter and better if we kind of did that as a collective activity and not sort of one-on-one, the way Mr. Trump prefers to deal with other countries. So 2025 is going to be an interesting year. I think it's going to be, from a defense of Canada point of view, an unstable and disappointing year. It's obviously an election year, and even if there's a new party elected, or whether the Liberals manage to pull out a miracle somehow, either way, they're going to take quite a bit of time, most of the rest of the year, to figure out what, if anything, they want to do in the area of defense, security, and foreign affairs. And so I don't see any significant new initiatives in the area of defense and security, which is too bad, because I think both the previous and the current CDS are right. We don't have a lot of time. We might have more than 5 years or not before things get potentially quite ugly in the world.
That brings us to the end of today's episode, and it also brings us to the end of the year 2024. It's my personal belief that the Institute made significant strides this year with its content production, and in particular, the production of this podcast. Thanks for tuning in with us every week for the past year. In the new year and beyond, we hope to continue improving the program, providing you with facts-based and balanced analysis of geopolitical events and Canadian defense and security issues, and we hope to continue attracting the best and brightest to our program for these vital discussions on Canada's national security interests and priorities. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so that you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email, or reach out to us on social media. And for more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you, and I hope you'll be joining us again for Season 4 in the new year. Happy holidays.